Okay, we're going to kick off the afternoon with a terrific talk. Dr. Dan Kammen, one of the world's foremost experts on energy and climate change. He's the Distinguished Professor of Energy at UC Berkeley. Most recently, he just finished a year-long appointment at the World Bank as its clean energy czar. During his distinguished career, Dan's advised state and federal governments, authored or co-authored 12 books, written more than 240 peer-reviewed journal publications, testified more than 40 times to state and federal congressional briefings. Dan's also served as the coordinating lead author for the IPCC, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. Congratulations again. He co-developed the property-assessed clean energy, what we all know as PACE financing model, which Scientific America named as the #1 world-changing idea of 2009. And as well as helped develop the low-carbon fuel standard. He received his bachelor's in physics from Cornell, his PhD from Harvard. He's held postdoc positions at Caltech and Harvard before teaching on the faculty at Princeton and now UC Berkeley. Dan, you're one of the rare people I know who understands national and international energy policy, understands technology, and understands economics in the policy landscape. It's my pleasure to introduce one of the leading minds in the energy industry, Dan Kammen.
Well, thank you so much, and I actually wish that was true. Sounds great, but it's a real pleasure to be here. It's a real honor to be here because so many people who I think about all the time, both in the World Bank role, which I've stepped down from, and back at Berkeley are here. So Joel and Ira, thank you. Brian Martell is here. Diane Gurnich is here. Hunter Levins, I'm looking forward to hearing later on. John Wellinghoff, who facilitated what I'll talk about in the end of this session, made it literally happen. And Kathy Zoe and Arun Majumdar, it's a real honor to get to do this. I won't make this World Bank story time. I certainly could. I learned on my second day there that if you have a passport that looks like this from the UN, you can pretend that you're James Bond. You show up at UN compounds around the world and they send out dark cars with black windows. Normally when you see that on the streets of Kampala or in Kinshasa, you run. This time you actually get in, and so it was a very strange and interesting situation. I'm going to use the time to try to make every mistake that an academic could make, and that is to show too many slides and to run too quickly through a number of things, but I hope there's a bit of a method to the madness. One is that I'm told that the slides are going to be available on the website, and I wanted to highlight some things which I hope really dovetail with what you heard from Professor Hart earlier today about the ability to integrate across what we so clearly need in industrialized, developed nations and what is so clearly needed in industrializing nations in terms of bringing clean tech in its broadest definition to meet all kinds of problems. And if there was one incredibly simple byline for the story, it is that around the world, the thing I learned while working at the World Bank, or was re-emphasized to me, is that the model of R&D has changed dramatically. And I think a lot of us know it intellectually, but seeing it in practice, where topics don't start at research labs at universities or at think tanks or at company research centers as much. They start with, at least in the energy and IT space, they start with a really fast-moving set of applications that you only do the right research on if there's enough of a machinery in terms of budgets and people to make it happen. And so the degree to which the problems that are faced by the global poor as individuals and as communities are sending clear messages that we as a global community, and I mean from academia to multinational lenders to the investment space, are not picking up on, not because we don't care about the needs of the poor, but because we don't innovate for they. You have to become part of the they to appreciate how immediate some of the problems are. And without getting into the meaning of what is and that sort of thing, I want to highlight in the comments the degree to which one has to integrate and see how these problems function at scales from the utility grid in the US to microgrids to individual solar household energy systems to really get a feel for it. So I'm not going to apologize for showing too many slides and going too quickly. I may not get everyone following me, but I'm going to try to highlight what I think are some of these incredibly important linkages from the lab to the market, to commercial ventures, to venture capitalists and back, and try to highlight not only why I think there's a huge amount of opportunity, just as Professor Hart said, but also if we can form more partnerships that I would like to see today, labs like mine, some of the companies and investors like yours, sitting down after this session or in coffee houses around the world afterwards, and finding real partnerships around R&D directed at specific problems. 30 years ago, that was not considered an okay form of academic research at U.S. universities. Now, the whole field of what is called applied research, or the term I prefer that Donald Stokes coined, use-inspired basic research, is now an area where you can legitimately build an entire career. And the lessons that come out of it are kind of dramatic. There's a number of persistent problems, one of which is global warming, but another of which is access to affordable energy. And I want to highlight how they fit together. I'll take one program as an example. It's a new UN effort called Sustainable Energy for All. That's this new chapeau, and I'll highlight that in a second. And I want to look at some of the drivers on the technology front that will allow us to get there, but then also talk about the system approach that we all talk about, but we don't do enough of, which really leads me to something that Hunter, I'm sure, will talk about later on, about whole system thinking, and I'll get back to that several times. And then again, I'm going to end with this plea for your assistance. I would like personally, with my lab, to sit down with many of you and talk about some actual partnerships, but I'm hoping more broadly that the new sort of energy and resource thinking going on at many universities can be made much more directly relevant. And a couple places, Berkeley, MIT, Stanford, Michigan, Cornell, have done very well in it, but there's lots of other resources in this area not being taken advantage of. So I list the website for the lab there to highlight the story. Let me start with the basic part of the equation, and that is that currently there's about 1.5 billion people on the planet who don't have access to electricity, and there's perhaps another billion who have intermittent or too expensive access or have to drive or walk 5 hours to go pay their utility bills. The International Energy Agency forecasts that with our current efforts, the situation will not change at all between now and 2030. So that is a almost 2-decade plan of failure. And so we have a clear need for these new models, just given the international community's assessment of we won't be changing the percentage of people who have access to modern energy services appreciably over this long period of time. We have lots and lots of plots that highlight the correlation between lack of access to electricity and not just using solid fuels, biomass, dung, waste, etc. in often inefficient stoves, but thanks to efforts of people like Secretary of State Clinton, there is a new focus on improved stoves, but it's not enough. We need to change this access equation, whether you're thinking about climate change or economic development or equity or human rights. It is the key missing part of the story. One version of that is what's motivated this drive by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to announce that 2012 is now the year of sustainable energy. And that's partially because the climate discussions and negotiations have gone so dreadfully poorly that let's find another angle that touches on many of the issues. And so what I'm plotted here over on the left are estimates from Bloomberg and others for the investment on an annual basis in clean energy, often between 1 and 300 billion, depending on your estimates. A number of estimates like Nick Stern's and others for what we have to spend to address the climate problem. But way over on the right is a small bar of about 36 billion, and that's the estimate global need to change this access story dramatically. And because it's so fundamental to other issues, improved quality of life, economic growth, et cetera, it's amazing that we're not engaging more of this community. Now, many of you are working on developing country issues and linkage issues between North and South, although it's a poor term. But that 36 billion should be our collective target to not only fill that financial need, which is not very large, but fill it with the kinds of projects that become sustainable and profitable economic projects. So the Sustainable Energy for All program, as a typical, very clear opening salvo, the UN's very good at that. The details are largely up to the people in this room, and it's to double the rate of energy efficiency improvement worldwide and to double the share of energy worldwide by 2030 that comes from renewables. Very clear message. Fits with many of the climate improvement forecasts that we need in terms of dealing with the climate problem, but really focused around access, local issues on energy, and again, all of these slides that we're putting online. If we start to think about this space, we've got to start with what are some of the technologies that are game changers. And I'm going to highlight just two examples in the solar space, one of which you saw briefly this morning when there was a picture of a company called D-Light. And I'm going to highlight this because it is an example of a technology that was widely poo-pooed by experts of many stripes and is now proven to be a real game changer. Very simple. I was there when many of the early discussions came on around very small solar panels powering very small LED lights. And in meeting after meeting I was at, and I won't name all the agencies, that uniformly said, this is a bad idea. This is a glorified flashlight that will break and won't work. And furthermore, it is poor man, and in particular, poor minority women's access to electricity, not at the level that a real household would have. Therefore, don't go there. Don't provide fraction of a watt solar panels with little efficient LED lights for lighting services because it won't go anywhere. And ministers of energy around the world and financial groups all chimed in. This was a bad plan. This program right now is a cooperation between the International Finance Corporation, the World Bank, and the U.S. Department of Energy, and there's been new partners added all the time. It has the name Lighting Africa. And this program, with a whole variety of products, has done remarkably well. It is in many ways an entrepreneur's dream, and some of the things beyond lighting services that made this program tick, I don't have a pointer here, but if you can see in both those pictures, there's the solar panel, of course, there's the light, and then there's a little bag there. And most of you know what that little bag is. Those are adapters so you can charge your cell phone off of this panel as well. Electricity in rural areas around the world routinely from diesel generators costs 60, 80, 90 cents. And charging your cell phone in a rural area has a massive value. When many of the companies that were working towards standards for the solar panels and the lights added this small bag of attachments to charge your cell phone, in 20 of the countries where we were active, out of 27, there was a noticeable and sustained jump in sales. Right? Adding a high value but low energy service was a remarkable feature. Is this full electrification? No. But did it change the equation? Absolutely. Another version, I mean, I had many places where I worked at the World Bank. Unfortunately, at one point, my monthly flight total was 50,000 miles a month, which is not good on other carbon footprints parts of the story. But here is yet another example, and it's an example of a trade-off that the world's newest country has to face. And the more engaged, thoughtful entrepreneurs they have, the better version of that choice they can make. This is the White Nile River flowing from the Ugandan border up towards the capital of this new country of South Sudan. As everyone knows, it's war-torn. There's incredible clashes with the north along the border. It's also a country where there's more than 6,000 foreign oil and gas workers in a place where there is 42 miles of paved road outside the capital, and it's a country the size of the Iberian Peninsula. That 42 miles of road happens to be U.S. aid sponsored. There's a picture of the White Nile. Here I am traveling with my bodyguard. The bodyguard's job was not so much to keep me from getting shot, but to keep me from walking onto the landmines. And because I was wearing my Giants shirt, it was anyway. The story I want to highlight, though, is a trade-off that South Sudan is being forced to make very soon. One country has offered South Sudan a $100 million grant to build 60 megawatts of run-of-the-river microhydro. The current national grid capacity is about 45 megawatts. 45. They will also build a regional transmission grid if they can get partners to help them work on the ground. It's a country that is rich but cautious in their investment efforts. Or they're being offered $1 billion up front and more down the line as a loan to dam that stretch of river, build a typical gigawatt large-scale hydro plant, and flood the entire region. So here's a picture of the rapids. This is called the Fula Rapids in South Sudan. And you can see water flowing back uphill. It's a remarkable site where, again, one country has proposed to offer them as a grant the money to build the local system. And South Sudan has to make a choice very rapidly on this. The amount of expertise on building and maintaining mini-grids, microgrids, larger connected systems is very low. The amount of interest in doing it with private sector partners is very high. It's exactly the sort of place where an integrated whole systems thinking about the opportunities to build up from solar home systems, biomass gasifiers, small waste energy systems feeding power into either localized grids or regional ones opens the door to a dramatic range of opportunities. And it's a choice. They don't have the luxury to wait for master's and PhD theses. They have to make it real time because one of their offers of funding expires and the other one is complicated. So it is a place where engagement now matters, and companies who have activities in East Africa, for example, and North Africa are primed to engage, and the government's been very open, despite its many problems, in terms of finding ways to make those connections happen. That's a developing country option. A developed country model, and the full disclosure is that the company I'm going to highlight right now I'm engaged with, so you can discount my enthusiasm if you want. But the story that I've told a number of places is of a day when two people from the IT world came into my office at Berkeley and said, "Why are you so stupid?" And I said, "Well, that's a great conversation starter." And they said, "Let me tell you why." And they said, "Well, you know, where you promote solar, you see people who install solar panels connected in series time after time, from the smallest solar home systems to the largest grid-connected systems. And they do that largely because solar panels are expensive, although the price is coming down dramatically, and the inverters are expensive. And they were designed before we had all of the hardware in your cell phone. And we talked for a while, and instead of connecting solar panels one to the next so that one shaded or dirty or otherwise not working panel brings down the output of the whole system, if you simply use the hardware in your cell phone, each panel can have its own inverter on the back, send its own power, its own AC power to the grid, and the improvements in doing so are dramatic. In fact, when we look across a range of systems, the energy gained from going from traditional large inverters that are basically sized to be 10 or 15% larger than your photovoltaic system to panel-size inverters means that for no additional cost, we find that the extra energy yield, in one case here 10%, another 30%, in fact, when we look broadly across them, on the order of 5 to 25% extra energy harvest from an expensive piece of hardware, a solar panel, comes from thinking differently about the process. And again, this conversation of why are you so stupid about promoting solar without innovating enough in terms of going away from old-style inverters is just a classic version of here's an innovation that makes every solar panel better, whether it's on a rooftop in South Sudan or whether it's on my 3.3 kilowatt rooftop in Oakland, or whether it's a larger system. And in fact, this company is finding that an unanticipated benefit is that if you set up these AC solar panels, you get away from high voltage systems, you make them easier to maintain, you make the balance of systems much more cost effective. And for any of us who have heard anyone from Germany lecture to us in the United States about solar, you know that the story they will tell over and over again is, why is it so expensive to install solar in the US relative to Germany? Because the paperwork to do it in the United States is a big, thick, complicated stack, in part due to these safety things, whereas in Germany, there's a one-page form, you put it down, fill it out. Under the feed-in tariff system, it is a much easier process, and innovations like this move quite rapidly. In fact, Portugal and Germany were dramatic and very large early customers of this company that ramped very quickly to over 1 million units shipped to the field. Technically doable, dramatic game changer in terms of how you think about solar. So that's on the hardware end, and we all know that we have to enable these transitions with technology and with policy. But we also have to highlight another aspect of the story, and this is really where I want to thank John Wellinghoff, because in our application for the data to build an incredibly high-resolution model of the U.S. grid, we never would have gotten it through without his help. And so I'm looking forward to his comments tomorrow, and I don't quite see him at the moment. I'm sure he's things. But I wanted to thank you for what you did. What we asked was, what if we built models of the U.S. grid that were so high resolution, both in space, which is relatively easy, but also in time, which is not easy, that we could look at it in time steps that were 15 minutes or less. And obviously our goal is to do essentially real-time versions of this model. The data is not available yet. We currently take 15-minute time steps. And these are the, I'll run through quickly, a couple slides from a paper that's embargoed today. It'll be released next Monday, but it highlights our first full version of this model. It's called the switch model, solar and wind integrated with transmission. And it is a model, currently we have versions for California, Washington, Oregon as a trio, and this version, I'll show you the pictures for the models for the WEC. High resolution, 15-minute time steps, incredibly detailed data, picture of the solar, the wind data, the status of transmission lines. We use FERC 715 forms, et cetera. And we won't go through the optimization, but what we do in this version is we minimize total system costs. So this is not at the utility level. We minimize the cost across the entire West. We apply the standard robustness analysis. What if you drop a power line out, a transmission line, so-called N-1 studies, and we study the robustness. We could argue all day about the rate of decrease of cost of solar. In this model, we actually show no decrease in the cost of nuclear, because you can argue that nuclear will go up, down, sideways, whatever. And we highlight versions of this story. So in our simulations, we currently run it across the whole U.S. West. And what we find is that under a range of different technology matches, high-cost solar, lower-cost nuclear, high-cost gas, low-cost gas, we find that quite robustly, if you control building and siting of power plants and of transmission, right, essentially not true today, that with a relatively high carbon cost, $70 a ton, a number that would make people in various circles gag, we find that not by 2050, but by 2030, you could realistically, with realistic build times, interest rates, the whole story, decarbonize dramatically. In fact, that little red circle on the top of the graph is hitting a equivalent of a 450 parts per million atmospheric content if the whole world was Western North America, which might be a dream of some of us, but maybe not. And you can see the mixture of solar and wind and biofuels and other things in that mix. You see coal ramps linearly downwards. We start building some nuclear later on. Nuclear we can't build in California, so this model maintains that. And in this picture, we do all the kind of the detailed run analysis. This is kind of a map of the source of supply. Gray is gas, dark blue is hydro, light blue is wind, purple is nuclear, solar is the yellow, red is geothermal, and you see a simplified version of the transmission. I haven't showed you the detailed one with all the transmission lines in there, but the key part of the story that we probably didn't need the model to build, but 4 years of modeling and detailed numbers was really the part that convinced me, is that there's a whole range of different technology and price scenarios, all of which are consistent with a couple decade transformation of the system, again with this massive caveat that you can coordinate essentially the activities that are going on in Kathy Zoe's old office and John Wellinghoff's office at the FERC. That is incredibly difficult. We all know the horror stories about build times and all of the financing issues, but it highlights, I think, to me, how dramatically different that story could be if we could work on many of the things that many of you have fought for, to make licensing more rapid, to make a more efficient process, to deal with many of the very legitimate claims of communities not to have facilities like transmission that they don't want to see, but to facilitate that process. It opens up a dramatic world of clean energy efforts. And in fact, at one end, we're building models like this of the US West. At the other level, we're building individual village scale models with much, much simpler software, and again finding that even if you don't have the ability to control things like the incredible pain that often goes into transmission projects, that the ability to think through what are the range of technology options and the range of transmission, distribution, supply, and I haven't even talked extensively about efficiency in this bit here, although it is in our models in a program called the California Carbon Challenge, that we see a real remarkable range of options that all meet some of the environmental targets we want. And the punchline I haven't gotten to yet is that this is a decarbonized or a dramatically decarbonizing electricity system with a very high carbon price, but with a very, very small increase in the price of electricity. In fact, across these scenarios, it is on the order of 10 to 20% increase in the price of electricity, not much higher than the business as usual forecast for those increases. Now, hopefully, I'm not stupid in the sense that I think that the world runs like one of my models. But I do know that while plans are nothing, planning is everything. And the ability to think through this across scales is really, in many ways, the key part of that equation. We are currently involved in efforts to build a version of this exact same modeling tool, this switch model for East Africa. We're working on two parts of India right now, and we have an overly ambitious effort in conjunction with the Chinese State Grid Research Institute and the North China Electric Power University to build a China one, although we'll do it in 5 pieces and then move them together over time. But again, it highlights some of the incredible technology options and ranges if you start thinking clearly about the whole system. The fact that we treat transmission and distribution assets just like power plants. They have different build times, they have different costs, but we think about them all in the same system is in many ways the key observation in kind of putting this sort of picture together. So I started off by talking about sustainable energy for all, and I took this large diversion into complexity and grids, but I want to come back to the call under the Sustainable Energy Plan that we're working with the Secretary General right now. Those targets of doubling the rate of improvement in energy efficiency and doubling the share of energy from renewables require a number of things, not just, in fact, a small footnote is the kind of modeling I described in the beginning. But what we clearly need and what you will be seeing in a number of asks that will come to you from a number of companies engaged in this process, Citibank, Bank of America, Vestas, Statoil, IBM, a number of companies are involved in this effort and are rolling out the Sustainable Energy for All program around the world right now. And what it is largely is best practice cases from industry for which the industry that's been engaged in them, or the company, or the municipality, is willing to work in a lead role to make those stories clear. Over the next 6 months, from now until Rio plus 20, the meeting in Rio de Janeiro in June, we will be collecting those cases. And at the risk of being flooded or having my assistant being flooded, I am Kammen at berkeley.edu, and we are honestly asking to reach out. Now, I won't deal with every one of them myself. I'm hoping that a significant fraction of you take this challenge seriously. But we have a quite impressive team spread between my laboratory, the University of Vienna, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, all working to vet and work with these cases as they come in. Efforts to build a global fund for feed-in tariffs, so-called Get Fit program that some of you have dealt with, are examples of kinds of efforts for which there's lead agencies, lead companies that want to work, and our job is to support those efforts to bring them into this global discussion. There's a whole series of milestones, a whole series of aspects of this program. I'm expecting, because I happen to have the attendee list here, that everyone here will be receiving Sustainable Energy for All announcements for where your companies, where your venture capital, where your angel investor firms are located. But this is an honest ask around what are the technologies like those lighting Africa lanterns, and like these microinverters, and like doing carbon budgets within certain firms that will allow this sort of transformation, whether it's motivated by the energy access, the carbon, the best business practice sorts of perspectives. And I highlight this for one other reason, and that is that we've seen that some of the thinking about these practices work remarkably well across scales, from poorest developing countries to some really highly industrialized ones. And I'll highlight a hackneyed example. I am a huge fan, in many ways, of the thinking behind the McKinsey curves, the carbon abatement curves that everyone here has seen. I'm well aware of the problems, the analysis, the staticness, etc. But what's interesting is that in thinking about marginal abatement curves at the global level to the many national level studies, this is a carbon abatement curve from Mexico, down to a village project. I'll highlight at the bottom. This is exactly one of those curves that one of my students built for a small rural fishing community in Nicaragua that has two forms of revenue. One is legal lobster catches, and the other one is illegal transport of a certain substance from South America. And we did not include that substance in the graph, although we probably should have. But this process began with some doctoral students at Berkeley and the University of Central America in Managua going out and doing energy efficiency audits for a community that had no grid. And it was largely initially so that these rural communities could save money by tying their diesel generators, the Honda generators in the backyard, together. That evolved very quickly to an offer from the national utility to provide efficient light bulbs for this rural community. It's a community of about 2,000 households near Bluefields, Nicaragua, for those of you who know the area. If the one industry in town, an ice-making plant that provided the ice to preserve the lobster, would agree to operate its in-house diesel generators for the good of the community if there was no additional demand. So by more efficient lighting and by more efficient refrigerators, if the extra power could then be provided to the community built and funded the local transmission grid. You can see on the curve that not only is this one of those marginal abatement curves for 2030, this is an effort that in 12 months went from a plan to in operation. The only thing that's not finished yet is the full range of solar purchases that people had planned to put on the system are not yet done because those are individual ones. All of the rest of that abatement curve isn't for 2030. It was planned in 2009 and done in 2010. In fact, the NGO that brought the community together, a group called Blue Energy, won one of the CNN Hero of the Planet Awards for their effort to bring this group together. And again, I'm not trying to claim that any given modeling perspective, whether the complicated one I showed for North America or the overly critiqued and in some ways overused marginal abatement curves are the answer. But the level of planning and assessment of the value of efficiency and renewables and judicious use of fossil energy transformed the process. This community now does these trainings for other communities in Central America. And it was a big deal for the members of this community to go to their industrial neighbor, Costa Rica, and train them in how to do this process. That in many ways fits into what we heard this morning about learning from the local needs, empowering the innovators, and finding that the process overall is profitable in making this all happen. Final example is that at that point, the mayor of Makati, the industrial core of Manila, asked a colleague of mine several years ago, what can we do about the pollution in the urban core, and what can we do about the jeepneys, the jeeps converted to small shared buses that many of you have seen. And in a high-profile case that I had the pleasure to profile on a TV show, they redesigned the jeepney, taking all the heavy steel, made them light and fiberglass, installed electric engines, and powered them with electricity harvested from urban waste. This was not the only thing, but the mayor of Makati at that time was, for a number of efforts like this, propelled to his new role. He is now the vice president of the Philippines. This is Mr. Binay. So again, an example of a process that came out of an assessment of a waste opportunity and has become quite a big deal in terms of working on urban air pollution, the quality of transport, a new industry, et cetera. I'm going to highlight a last point that many of you know, and many of you, like Brian Martell, who are here, know far better than me. In fact, these slides are from Brian, and that is the degree to which finding and facilitating these investments is an absolutely critical part of the story. So in many ways, we were starved for capital in the sector in the mid-2000s, and investments, CalPERS, New York State Investment Fund, et cetera, facilitated a whole range of investments. No one-to-one correlation, but when you look at all of the firms, all of the efforts that were at least at some degree facilitated by these levels of investments, we see a real transformation. Less than $1 billion, motivating in many ways almost 10 times that amount in terms of other venture efforts. And of course, the story I'm saying now is far more complex than one slide worth. And it only happened because many of you in the room worked so hard on the individual deals and worked so hard in terms of what were the places where a pure private sector or a public-private partnership was the key part of the story. In fact, I'll end here time-wise, but part of the end story that Brian's group, Environmental Capital Group, worked on was, in fact, very clear methods to assess companies, metrics that were used across many of the investments. And if we go back to my initial points about the goals for sustainable energy for all and about these grid and other level models, in many ways what I'm calling for more than any particular tool is a series of clear goals where research plays a role, where innovative venture capital firms play a role, and where the scale up is possible because there's a clear transparency about how the operations work together. That's in many ways the hallmark of the efforts that we were talking about in terms of these grid efforts. So I'm going to skip a few, but just put up the last one because I really do hope that you take seriously the request and the offer. Both my lab would very much like to work with many of the groups here. We got our initial seed funding, for example, for that switch model in a partnership with Vestas. We then transitioned to working on this for the state of California and now Washington. But the real goal here is to see these kinds of projects spread. And I know you do this every day, but what I'm hoping I conveyed is that the scale of the types of opportunities are much broader than many of us thought. It's certainly broader than I realized before going to the bank for a year. And I think I'll close with the least successful on paper piece of what I did at the World Bank. And so I went there with a particular piece of timing. I was interested in these projects, but the timing of my arrival was I was asked to come and to work on the World Bank's energy strategy, which is a 10-year document. I went back and I read the one 10 years before I arrived, and it was called Fuel for Thought. I said, wait a second. If it's not called Fuel for Doing, it's a worthless piece of paper here. So I figured I can at least do better than that. And over the past year, I worked on the bank's energy strategy. And in many ways, it is a 100-page document that has not yet been passed through all the committees. It's a 100-page document of which 2 lines are important. One line is the bank will no longer lend for coal-fired projects in middle-income countries. It will lend for coal in the poorest countries in certain conditions. I'm not sure I completely agree with that, but there's a good argument for it. but given how mature coal is, using World Bank's $8 billion energy portfolio on coal in middle income doesn't make much sense. And the second point was that the bank will conduct life cycle carbon analysis for all energy projects. A year of work, 2 sentences. And I'm delighted to have that to be the outcome, and I'm hoping that this will be passed in the near future. We will see. Rio Plus 20 is the next stage on which this will be debated and discussed. It has been very contentious, but again, I'm hoping that the clarity of the metrics and the aspects of the story kind of reinforce what I've tried to highlight, and that is that we are keenly interested to find opportunities to build these alliances for which so many of these innovations in clean energy and access to water, better stoves, these micro-inverters, all fit into a picture for which my lab in particular would be delighted to work with you. So thanks the host, and thank you for the chance to speak today.